So I want to make one final video on the Affliction League, going over my thoughts about the league, the good and the bad, as I feel like a few people probably want to hear my opinion, so I thought I might as well make this video. So first, we can talk about what I dropped. So on the right side of my screen, you can see some of the things I dropped. So that's 22 raw mirrors, not mirrors I brought, just dropped on the ground, 9 Headhunters, 12 Magebloods, 9 Squires, 13 Ring Calandras, 63 other tier 0s, and then 60 Doctors when I was farming Burial Chambers. So as you can see, it's quite insane with 22 raw mirror drops. I'll probably never have a league like this again. It's more mirrors than Headhunters and Magebloods combined. Yeah, now let's get to my personal, I guess, opinions about Affliction League. So I wrote this whole text document here, and I'll go over everything in depth. Yeah, this is my general thoughts on Affliction League. What was good and what was bad is from a high-end map and perspective. No MF and MF, because I do both, but ever since like a Calandra, pretty much only MF has been a viable high-end mapping strategy. Nothing else really comes close, unfortunately. Hopefully that does change in the future. Yeah, let's talk about the good. So the good was mapping was generally just more fun. We had multiple viable maps and strategies throughout the league. In previous leagues, pretty much only boxes was the only viable MF strat, and that's how it's been since Sanctum League, which this league surely has changed. Boxes is no longer the most dominant strat. There is a ton of viable strats. You can do Abyss, you can do Legion, you can do a Legion and boxes, of course, but right, it's not just one strat that everyone follows. You can do what you want, and of course there are mechanics better than others, namely Abyss being a quite big abuser, but that's fine if it's only for one league. So yeah, mapping was just really, really fun. And one thing I really liked about this league was that any map was truly viable. If you want to farm cells, you could farm cells and probably still make a lot of profit. Any map you want to do was viable. And of course, there are some maps better than others, like Jungle Valley and Burial Chambers. Obviously, are two of the best maps this league, but still, you could play any map and still make a ton of profit as long as you could do some good league mechanics on them. Which brings me to my next point. Other league mechanics are actually good and rewarding because of Affliction. So generally, if you're not familiar with MF, if you are a new MF player, doing any league mechanic outside of strong boxes is complete waste of time, which this league changed. Last league, the only thing I was doing was strong boxes, and that's it. And that's how I made all my currency, because doing stuff like Legion, Abyss, whatever, just slowed you down way too much, especially as a solo player. Now, in a group setting or whatever, it's a little bit different. But I will say, as a solo player, pretty much the only thing worth doing in previous leagues was boxes. So it was really, really nice in a change of pace that stuff like Legion, Abyss, Alva, even all that was viable. It made mapping generally a lot more fun. I have a lot more fun in a map when I'm doing like a bunch of league mechanics and not just clicking on boxes. Next, massive loot bombs were really satisfying and was fresh out of a league where div card farming wasn't the best strategy. So once again, if you're new to MF, generally the only viable MF strategies is when you're farming for a divination card. So in previous leagues, it's generally the apothecary, or depending on prices, it could be the brother's gift if apothecary isn't worth that much. Last league mainly, it was only Crimson Temple because apothecary was 70 divines, and therefore farming any other map or doing any other strategy was pointless because apothecary was worth so much. Yeah, it was really, really nice to have these like big loot bombs, 100 wing scare explosions or like 40 plus divines, right? And it wasn't just about the apothecary drop-in. You just made, general currency from this raw divines and wing scarabs drop-in. This is something I do hope that does change in the future leagues, where it's more than just div card farming. Yeah, another pro is the maps were more challenging, which personally for me made the game a lot more enjoyable. Every upgrade actually mattered, even when you're like 5 mirrors deep in the character. My character right now, as you might know from previous videos, is worth like 50 plus mirrors, and every upgrade I got really made the character way more meaningful than before. It was very fun to upgrade and gear your character this league. I'll talk about this more later, but yeah, one of my main gripes up PoE right now, that the game has been pretty easy, and this league mechanic brought back a lot of challenges to the game, which I think was very, very good. Next good point is I think this was the best version of Borrowed Power that they made so far. Personally, for me, it was way more enjoyable than Crucible, Tattoos, and Relics for two reasons. First one, the lead mechanic was actually enjoyable to do. Unlike Crucible wasn't that enjoyable to do. Personally, for me, Tattoos also were enjoyable. And I'm in a minority here, but I'm not a fan of Sanctum, so this was more fun to Sanctum as well for me. So in that way, it was way more fun to interact with the Borrowed Power system. And another fact is, I think the settings are just really cool and made for a lot of new, viable, unique builds. So yeah, in my opinion, this was the best version of Borrowed Power. Now it is probably going to go away, but I do hope they take some stuff from this and into the game, even if they have to increase the challenge of the game, because it was really fun. So yeah, now let's start with the bad. Now there is quite a bit of negatives. I see a little bit more than the good, but it's not as bad. It's just more so a few points were pretty annoying. Anyway, let's start with the bad real quick. So because of the challenge, which we just talked about, which was pretty good for the game, there was a lack of viable MF builds, or even builds in general, because the league was so challenging that it felt like unless you were playing like the best builds, it felt pointless, right? Like, because they're just so far behind. The difference between something like Tornado Shot and Corrupt and Fever in the previous league, for example, would be like, maybe like a minute or so on your map. It wasn't that bad. Like, you could play Corrupt and Fever if you wanted to, even though Tornado Shot was better, but it wasn't a big deal. This league, essentially Corrupt and Fever would be completely unviable, while Tornado Shot was just so far above the rest. So yeah, this is just largely a balance issue that GG has to fix, and this league really just showed how bad it was. Some builds are just completely unviable this league, and some are so far above the rest that it feels pointless to play anything else, which is the second point here. Then on, I really made the best build, Tornado Shot, like the only build worth playing at high end. This is specifically for MF. There are some other good MF builds, but generally, yeah, high end TS build is just unbeatable. Stuff like Penance Brand, Poison, whatever, was really good. The high end, it would still lose out to TS and all that. And the end point here, usually tier 2 or tier 3 MF builds aren't that far behind, but in this league they were. For example, I've considered like Corrupt and Fever like a tier 2 or tier 3 MF build, while this league was essentially just one of the worst MF builds you could play because it simply does not have the damage. So yeah, but like I said, this is largely a balance issue. It's not the lead mechanic's fault. The lead mechanic just really showed, how much balance this game currently needs, because some builds are just so far above the rest that when we get into a difficult content, it makes any other build feel pointless to play. Just like, while I could play something like KB or maybe like BV, it feels bad to play these builds that are just like, 20 or 30% slower, because then you're just making like 20 to 30% less currency, or in previous leagues, they were pretty close in terms of like how fast they were. But this league, yeah, they just aren't. The next negative is way too much loot that it even causes the game to lag, hampers your enjoyment at the game quite heavily. So I think this is something that everyone can agree on. The lag this league was just stupid. It was way too much lag, and it was only this much lag because there was too much loot. I'm not really sure what happened, but yeah, it should never be to the point where there's too much loot that the game just lags. If you ever did high-end MF this league, you know what I mean, where there's 0 monsters, you're not attacking, all you're doing is looting, and you only have 1 FPS because there's simply too much loot. And despite, if you hide loot, for example, with like the in-game option or whatever, this doesn't do anything. The game still lags. You're just straight up with 1 FPS. Once again, if you play this league at high MF, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But yeah, it was quite bad, and not really sure what happened, but hopefully this doesn't happen again, because personally for me, it really kind of killed my enjoyment for this league. It's not fun playing a game with 1 FPS, which kind of adds on to my next point. Everything eventually became worthless outside of boss uniques and mirrors. Pretty much no excitement when finding a Headhunter or Mageblood at this point. So yeah, to really rephrase on that, I hit leather belt to my filter because Headhunter is like 45 divines at the time of making this video. Everything's just kind of worthless, which makes the game a lot less enjoyable, because the only thing you're finding is essentially scarab explosions and divines, and that's it. And of course, like raw mirror drops. So there's no other big drop you're looking forward to. There's no like, oh man, I get a Mageblood, it's for like 300 divines. There's essentially nothing. Like I said, it's just mirrors, divines, and scarabs. This is just because of the league though, the mechanic, it was just way too rewarding. I think it's something that a lot of people can agree on. While it was fun, it got to the point, not even that much weeks into the league, I think like 1 month into the league, where everything just became worthless outside of boss uniques and mirrors, which goes on to the next point. Add on, MF isn't as fun when it's just divines. It's more fun when tier 1 and tier 0 uniques actually have some value. The whole point of MF is to find a valuable uniques, right? Which I'm at the point where I'm about to turn off every unique on my filter because, like I just said, none of it is valuable outside of some, tier 1s that you could corrupt. Like Unnatural Instinct isn't valuable by itself, but if you corrupt and get corrupted blood on it, then it is valuable, which is like, sure, it can happen, but it's a lot less exciting when the only valuable stuff you get uniques is corruption and not the unique itself. Like, I think last league, for example, Unnatural Instinct was worth like 5 divines for the whole league. 5 divines was worth quite a bit of currency last league compared to this one. So it was always fun to actually find that unique. So yeah, there's nothing much they can do here outside of just limit CAC not being a thing next league. Obviously, uniques having value is probably good for the game, and where it ended on this league, where every unique being worthless, is probably not so good for the game. And I guess the next point, which is kind of like added on to all these points, GG missed the mark pretty hard. We could have had 50% of loot, and it still would have been insane. This is something I really want to talk about. We could have literally just had half the loot, and I don't think anyone would have complained, and everyone still would have loved the mechanic just as much. Like, if you're dropping 20 divine explosions instead of 40 divines, or dropping 50 wing scarabs over 100 wing scarabs, you probably still would have just as much fun, because you wouldn't have known that, oh yeah, it could have been 100 wing scarabs. So obviously you can't hurt the loot mechanic this late in the league, but yeah, they definitely missed the mark pretty hard. It could have been way less rewarding, and I think we still would have had just as much fun, and also would have made items way more valuable for way longer in this league. But it's just, a minor gripe. And for reference real quick, profit an hour for high-end solo MF is around 150 to 200 divines. Even more sometimes. We really don't know the mirror drop rate, and this mirror drop rate kind of heavily inputs this divine an hour. Like I said, personally, I have 22 mirrors dropped. If I do my / played real quick, I have 27 days played, with probably, 2 or 3 days of this being AFK time while I'm making videos, for example, right now. So yeah, I almost found essentially 1 raw mirror per day played, which is kind of insane. But that's, adds to this profit an hour. And for last league, for example, profit an hour was around, 25 div an hour at the high end. So roughly anywhere from like 6 to 8 times more profit an hour than it was compared to last league, which goes back to my previous point where even if the league had 50% of the loot, we still would have had like 75 to 100 div an hour. I still would have had like 11 raw mirror drops, for example, right? The limit mechanic still would have been insane. Even though it was pretty fun, profit an hour being this much is kind of silly a little bit. Now to talk about the worst thing about the league, this maybe should have been #1 here, but yeah, maps became very tedious if you want to win max. So widescreen advantage should just never be a thing, but in this league, widescreen advantage became like a real thing in the Wildwood. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, while in the Wildwood, if you have widescreen, you get to see your left and right more. So why does this matter? In the Wildwood, if you can see a left and right side of the screen way farther in distance than you can compared to normal no widescreen, allows you to see refresher orbs way easier, so your time in the Wildwood would be increased. Now, of course, this isn't always an advantage, but it does help in quite a bit of maps. My testing, it was like 1 in 10 maps where this actually gave an advantage, which isn't too much, but that does increase your profit per hour. Yeah, I hope this is a thing in the future leagues. I hope this is something they can just avoid. But yeah, something like widescreen advantage just shouldn't be a thing. It's no one has fun like going to the options, going to like windowed mode and giving yourself widescreen in game. It's not fun to do, and it's also just not fun to be at a disadvantage if you don't want to do it or don't have a widescreen. Next thing is you just end up spending way too much time in the Wildwood and not playing the game, simply because you end up leaving 50% of your maps is the optimal thing to do. So of course not everyone does this, not everyone has to do it, but it got to the point where we find out, yeah, we can max the Wildwood so much that, we can average like 7k wildwood juice a map, meaning we should just leave any map that is below like 6k for example, because on average we should be over 7k. And because the lead mechanic is so rewarding, it's just worth it to leave like a 5k map, because your next map will be like 8k for example. An 8k map compared to a 5k map is probably like something like maybe 100 to 200% more currency drops. The lead mechanic scales quite hard. I'm pretty sure it has exponential scaling. But yeah, this hammers in the whole, leave half your maps, because there's no point in wasting time with a, 5k juice map, because that maybe only drop like 5 divines, where an 8k juice map will drop like 20, 25 divines, right? So yeah, it just added more noise to this league, where, sometimes it has left like 3-4 maps in a row because of really bad RNG, stuff like strong boxes or spiders. You just leave the map, have to go next. It's just not worth your time, which means you end up spending like way too much time in the wildwood and not enough time actually killing monsters. The fun part, right? So yeah. So while wildwood was fun, one thing I do hope in the future is that they do have another in-game lead mechanic. Don't make it viable to where it's just straight up the optimal strategy to leave the map if you get bad RNG, because that kind of makes, it kind of takes out a lot of the enjoyment when doing maps. It's not fun just to do the wildwood for like 15 minutes straight, because you had to leave like 3 or 4 maps in a row. So yeah, that's the good and the bad. Now I want to go over my overall conclusion real quick, the takeaway of this video, if you will. Having other league mechanics be rewarded again would be a step in the right direction. Whilst, next league, we're just gonna go back to boxes and that's all that matters. So this is something I talked about at the beginning of the video. But yeah, I really hope other league mechanics are rewarded again, stuff like Legion, Abyss, or whatever, Alva especially, all these league mechanics. It was really fun doing these in Affliction. I do hope next league we can go back to this meta, where we're doing league mechanics and not just ambush, or just, known as boxes. So yeah, I really hope that they can implement this in the future. Maybe if not next league, but the league after. So I really want to do other stuff besides just boxes. While the wildwood was fun, a league mechanic shouldn't be so rewarding that you're willing to leave 50% of your maps just to fish for good maps. So I obviously just talked about this, why it's a bad thing. And this should be in general for like every league mechanic. You shouldn't just like, go to a map, oh, I got bad RNG, leave the map, go next map. Even with 4 wing scarabs, it was worth to do this. So yeah, I did just talk about this, but leaving maps just because you got bad RNG shouldn't be a thing. You should go to a map with the intention of clearing it, right? I think that's something we can all agree on. Next one is, this league showed how badly some skills unbalance. We need both buffs and nerfs. So yeah, like I was saying earlier, Tornado Shot is so far above the rest of the skills, specifically for MF. Some skills are pretty close, like Penance Brand is pretty good. Obviously, Detonate Dead is also pretty good, but it really showed how far behind some skills are, or maybe it's just Tornado Shot is too good. But for example, Corrupt and Fever, this skill was just completely dead this league because of how challenging the league was, and it really showed, how much balance this game currently needs. Whether that is buffs or nerfs, I don't know. That's up for GG to decide. But yeah, I really want more viable skills. Usually I would make like, 3-4 viable MF builds a league. But this league, I felt like there really was no point of playing anything but TS because of how far ahead it was compared to other skills, especially when you have multiple mirrors to invest. The last thing I want to point out here is, yeah, having the game be challenged again is something I missed a lot and something I hope GG can bring back. The game has been pretty easy for the past few years because of said power creep. So yeah, I really love when a game is challenging and it's more fun to min-max a character when the min-max actually matters. In previous leagues, essentially there was like no point of upgrading past like 1 or 2 mirrors into your character because there was just no challenge in the game if you're doing maps. There was nothing that like you could throw out your map to make it harder to make those upgrades matter. Compared to this league, if you only had 1 or 2 mirrors into your character, you could still be struggling on like just 12k juice maps. I mean, you actually felt upgrades going past like 1 or 2 mirrors, specifically at an MF standpoint. Obviously, if you're playing a regular build, then usually 1 or 2 mirrors, even for this league mechanic, is probably a cap, and you want to feel that much after. But yeah, from an MF standpoint, 2 mirrors felt like it wasn't enough for this league mechanic, which personally made it a lot more enjoyable for me, because upgrading your character to handle, harder content is probably the essence of ARPGs, and it's something this game has been missing for quite a while. This challenge has personally just been very, very fun. I hope it's something they can replicate in future leagues or bring back in some way. High-end map juice should be hard, should be challenging, and you should be able to upgrade your character to overcome that, which is just something we have been missing in the past few leagues. So yeah, that's my whole TLDR on Affliction. Not sure how much I rambled, how much people are still listening at this point, but I thought I'd give my own opinion on the whole league, because yeah, it definitely is one of my favorite leagues, but it does have quite a bit of bad to it, but also quite a bit of good. I wouldn't mind hearing your opinion down below, your thoughts on Affliction League. I'm probably gonna not play as much, but yeah, this league has been very fun, and I do hope future leagues are just as good. But yeah, that's about it.